So Tom, take us to before the DST, right? You're doing deals, you're looking at deals, you're looking at tax, right? Take us through kind of like the big, problem or challenge that you faced before we started to connect and talk about strategy with the DST.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting too. So let me go kind of back to what was the genesis of my founding of the DST. You will find Brett is invited to high net worth events, people who are strategic about their capital. That's how I ended up finding him. I think it was through some sort of podcast. I think with Marco Santarelli, maybe, good friend. Anyway, so I looked into it. I was doing an exit. 1031s were kind of like what everyone was doing. But one thing I often see with wealthier people in 1031s, they're fine vehicles initially, but at some point you hit the ceiling. And what I mean is there's only so many deals that are 10, 20, $40 million. And of course we know about the shot clock forcing you to make bad decisions. And so you do a big enough deal and then you do another deal that essentially should be doubling your money. You're going to come up into a corner where you don't have any deals to find. And then you're going to be forced, very, very much like VC firms were in the last few years, to make bad choices. And that's kind of what concerned me, is that the path of a 1031 ends up putting you in a corner where that's one of the biggest strengths of the DST from my point of view, is that there's this ability to be nimble and flexible. And there's not really a cap. And what I mean is if you decide to buy a multifamily building, you turn around and flip it. Now you're buying a tower for call it 20, 30 million. You flip it, make 10 million. Now you're $40 million. That rules you out of a lot of asset classes. But now you can pivot and go to a different asset class within the DST. That's what attracted me to it. And then I'll say, just before I made a decision, going back to my OCD sort of risk hedging, I flew out to Napa. Brett drove with his lovely wife about an hour and a half to meet us. And we sat down with some wine, got him a little boozed up to see if he was truly the character he says he was. And here we are now. So I went through that process to vet him out. So that's kind of all in one why I chose the DST.
Okay, excellent. I'm glad that worked out.
I'm calling you out, man.
Yeah, no, that was an awesome trip. I think it was Camus, right? Camus, yeah. Right? Yeah, Camus. And you also introduced me to some new stuff on wines. Although we were close to Napa, just an hour and a half away. Tom's extensive vintage and I think taste for wine is definitely more refined than mine. So okay, so it sounds like the 1031 exchange, right? And just understanding the strategic kind of back to the OCD downside risk hedging. It's like, hey, you've seen enough that as you get bigger and bigger deals, they're harder and harder to put together, and the risk it's even greater, right? And I think that also leads into equal greater value, but equal or greater debt, right? That's the thing that people I think sometimes miss that. And you give an interesting kind of what's going on right now with interest rates that have jumped over 100% in about a year. It can put yourself in an increased risk position that perhaps you didn't want to be in. So you kind of you've seen that, you sensed that, you felt that, and so now enter the world. Something you talked to Marco Santarelli. Thank you, Marco, if you're listening to this. He's great, by the way. Then you're going, okay, let's explore the deferred sales stress. So take us to that next step of just the discovery phase of the DST and what kind of questions someone should be asking if they're looking at this for the first time.
Yeah, great question. It was very foreign to me when I first learned about it. And even the legal docs are very extensive. Now I have a legal team, like many of them. I spend way too much on them, but love them to death. I had them double check it. So that checked out. My main concern was, one, is this legal? So it's probably worth talking about that, Brett. I think the structure of how it works is pretty important, and it can quickly become complex, but at the end of the day, understanding that piece, which is essentially you're giving up ownership to an entity that you still kind of own, and then you're borrowing from the entity to use those funds for something else, right? So I think just understanding that process was really important. And that, I spent several hours going through that and really understanding the ins and outs. So that was helpful, because on the outside, it does seem complex. It almost seems too good to be true. But there are some costs to it. There are some, some things that you have to do, like we just did our accounting for this year and sent you over our K1s and all of that. So there's some work. It's not, like 100% perfect world, but it's overall fantastic. So